Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out this morning here at Albion Free Methodist Church. It is a good week coming up. I really do hope every one of you gets the opportunity to come out for VBS. It should be a great time, and I think that's a good word for it. I think this place is going to be buzzing with lots of activity and kids learning about God. And seriously, if you have some time, feel free to stop on out there. There have been a lot of effort and time that has gone into it. And I know that the teens will appreciate it, or the kids, sorry, you can tell I'm the youth pastor. The kids will appreciate it, and I know that God will bless that work. You may have noticed something that's changed recently is the kids' quote verse. We figured, no longer a weekly quote verse, as we thought we'd like to give the kids more of an opportunity to really learn and really understand these quote verses. So we've made the move to a monthly quote verse. And because this is kind of a Bible quizzing type Sunday, we're all wearing the Bible Quiz Finals t-shirts for those of us that went. We'd like to also kind of extend a challenge to the adults and everyone else in the congregation. Just because it says kids quote verse does not mean that other people who are not kids cannot learn it. And I've heard from a lot of different people that, it's difficult to memorize, and yes, it is, and yes, it takes time, and yes, it takes effort, but it is worth it. And so I would encourage all of you, if you look down there, the kids' quote verse for July is one of my favorite verses, and I picked it out. It is Micah 6:8, and it says, "He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God." And so that is a verse that if you would like to take the opportunity and memorize that this month, please do that. And if you have a child of, children's church age who wants to come out and quote that, we'll be standing out there. Someone will have a giant big bag of something to give away. And if you can quote that verse, we would be more than happy to give that out. And you know what? Why not? If you can quote the same verse 4 or 5 weeks in a row, we'll give you 4 or 5 treats. Why not? So there you go. And adults, if you've never memorized one of these quotes before, and you really have a sweet tooth, and you want to memorize the verse, and you really want some candy or something for that, you know what? Why not? I will even give the adults some candy if you guys memorize this verse. So anyway, the sermon this morning is kind of a long story. It spans a lot of different chapters in the Bible, and it's on King David. And it's one of the great things because, I firmly believe that God has a sense of humor. And every time it seems that I write or I plan a sermon or I'm sitting in the shower, showering, and everyone knows that's where you do your best thinking, so that's where half of my sermons get mostly written. I think that God just kind of likes to tweak us on the nose every once in a while and go, "I got you." So, last night it was kind of funny because I was out with some of my extended family, and they're all sitting in that row right there. If you just want to give a little short wave, you don't have to stand up or anything. That's my cousin David and his parents and their extended relations. I'm not sure how to refer to you guys. It's through marriage a couple times and all sorts of things. But so they came to be with us last night, and we went out to eat, and we went to a Chinese place, and we got this fortune cookie. And it was funny because they were going to be coming here the following morning, and then this is the fortune that I found when I broke open my fortune cookie. So who's to say that God cannot use absolutely anything to speak to you? And I'm not saying God is using this fortune cookie, but hey, you know what? I don't believe in coincidences, so maybe there's something going on this morning. But anyway, back to that title slide for the sermon. It's funny because Jan always does a great job of posting this on the Facebook group every week, and so everyone gets the tiny little red one, and everyone gets all excited and checks their notifications. And Melanie checked hers and looked at me, she's like, "Isn't that kind of a long subtitle?" And of course, and it is, and I had to admit it was, but it was really hard for me when I was going through everything I wanted to cover in the story of David this week. How do you break down the story of David in the Bible into a neat little tagline? And so that's a rather complicated little tagline. But I think this concept of waiting on the Lord is really what I wanted to get to this morning. If we're truly in God's world and we're truly in God's time and in God's plan, waiting on the Lord it's kind of a state of being. It's not, I'm waiting for the Lord to answer this prayer. It's, I am always and continually waiting on the Lord. And I think that David in particular, he had this nailed down. He is, in my mind, he's one of the champions of waiting on the Lord. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 different passages from 3 different chapters this morning. And I just want to tell the story first and to do a little bit of narrative along the way. And then to talk a little bit more about, what. Flexibility, it's a wonderful thing. Alrighty, so good thing that was there. So anyway, so we're going to be talking through 3 different scripture passages, and we'll be dealing with that. And Matt, if this comes back on, just give me a thumbs up, and I'll switch this one off. So we were going through this story, or I was this week, and I was looking at the 3 stories, and the first one, just to get right into it, is from 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. So it will be up there on the screen, but if you've got your own Bibles and you'd like to make notes, please do that. Please scribble things that have occurred to you and things that God is sharing with you. So like I said, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. And this should be a pretty familiar story to many of you. So it begins like this. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' So invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider the appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and said, "Let him pass in front of Samuel." But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to them, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And every time I hear this story, I think about exactly what must have been running through David's mind at this point. If you're just this little kid out, tending the sheep, and there are little hints as you go through that story. If Samuel goes to the beginning and the council elders and the city leaders come to Samuel and they say, "Well, what are you doing here? Do you come in peace?" And then there's no break. There's no point where Samuel goes and finds Jesse. He just tells Jesse, "Hey, come with me." He just consecrates them and brings them with. Which means that, Jesse probably was a prominent man in the city if he was already there when Samuel was speaking to all the leaders. But this prominent man in the city brings his sons with him and doesn't send for the littlest one. And so David has no idea any of this is going on. From David's perspective, it's a normal day. He's out, he's tending the sheep. He's not dressed up. He doesn't have anything special going on. And suddenly they say, "Oh, well, Samuel wants to see you." And he's not sitting down until you get there. So he's running into the city, and he has got to get there as quickly as possible. So he's probably a little bit out of breath. He probably is healthy and ready in appearance because he's probably read from running. You guys from Run for God probably know that. And so if you've got this out-of-breath kid, he wasn't even summoned to go along, and Samuel immediately looks at you, and when you're all out of breath and you just finished probably running, and anoints you. And from that day on, you just have this presence of God with you. That's a lot to put on a kid. And so I imagine, how would this have affected David as he grew up? How would this have changed the way he saw his life, or how he ministered, or how he tended sheep? Does it change him? Does he have this connection with God that it's rare? It doesn't happen every day. And so as this story unfolds, it's not quite so surprising maybe that David is as involved and as public and as effective a figure. Because after all, he had the anointing of God on him. So only 2 chapters later, which implies that Samuel was still young, we're going to read 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 16 also. And so this is actually 1 Samuel 17, for those of you who are especially familiar with Bible cartography, is the killing of David and Goliath. So this is shortly after that, I imagine. 1 Samuel 18 says, "Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all of the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. And as they danced, they sang, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his tens of thousands.' Now Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly, which is a very subtle way of saying he was very angry. So they have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. And the next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house when David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand and hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in all their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved King David because he led them in their campaigns. And so this is kind of the aftermath of David's celebrity status following killing Goliath. You know, you see him coming back, and, you know, it would be bad form not to praise the king. So you start out saying, well, Saul has killed thousands. But David has just killed Goliath. He killed a giant. But David has killed his 10,000s. And as much as Saul was, well, greatly displeased, you know, you can imagine, you know, as king, it's kind of your job to be top of the heap. It's your job to be just head and shoulders above everyone else. And Saul was taller than everyone else, so he was used to being able to look down literally and figuratively on the entire nation. And so as David starts gaining in popularity, and as he starts succeeding in all of the campaigns he's leading, and as his own officers approve of David's high rank, you can imagine Saul's probably getting a little paranoid at this point. You can imagine that Saul is beginning to fear David, and he's starting to grow really apprehensive. He's sending him on more dangerous missions, maybe, hoping he would get killed. And through all of this, you can only imagine how difficult it must have been for David to keep a level head. I mean, imagine for a minute that you are, you know, going out to war. You're not even old enough to be really conscripted yet. So you are still back home watching the sheep. You've already got this experience where you know you've been anointed by God. And then you go to visit your brothers and end up killing the giant that the entire army was afraid of. And then to make things even more pronounced, as you're coming home, you suddenly realize that everyone's cheering for Saul and saying he's killed thousands, and they're cheering more for you because you've killed tens of thousands. You want to talk about a kid who's on top of his game. David's it. David has everything worldly he could possibly want. He's got the approval of an entire nation, all of Israel and all of Judah. He's got the approval of the officers he works with, the men who follow him. He is successful in everything he does because of the Lord's anointing. If you just had to take a stab and you didn't know this was David from the Bible, and I painted this picture of a person, you would imagine this person would probably be incredibly conceited. And yet this next story we're about to read illustrates the exact opposite. It's from 1 Samuel. This is from chapter 24, jumping forward a bit after Saul had continued to pursue David, continued to try and kill David time and time and time again until David is in hiding. So 1 Samuel 24 begins this way. It says, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in it to relieve himself. David and his men were in the far back of the cave. And the men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and said to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say that David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is sure the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. I doubt there are many people ever that could do what David had done. In this situation, you can imagine, there's this tight-knit group of guys. The people that David trusts most gathered in the back of the cave while Saul is relieving himself and totally unaware of the danger he's in. And it says here, they looked at him and said, this is that day that they spoke of, when the Lord will give Saul into your hands. This is that day. You can kill him now and be done with it. You don't have to hide anymore. We don't have to sit around in caves. You can finally come into what God has promised you. The idea is they're telling him that he deserves it. He's been promised it by God. All he has to do is reach out and take it. And David's response is, I imagine he doesn't tell them beforehand what he's going to do. But he creeps up and he finds the robe, which I can't imagine he cut it off of Saul while he was wearing it. Maybe it's piled off to the side or something. And he just cut off a corner of the robe and left. And he gets back, and you can imagine his friends all look at him and they're like, why do you just have a corner of the robe? Why isn't Saul dead? And David has to sharply rebuke them to keep his friends from attacking Saul. So not only does David refuse to do it himself, he refuses to allow anyone else to raise a hand against Saul, who he repeatedly calls the Lord's anointed. Saul was anointed before David. Saul rejected God by choosing to sacrifice by himself instead of waiting for the prophets. And by doing that, Saul rejected his role. And it's after that that David was anointed. So David is the new anointed. David is the new king. He's chosen by God. He has, every way you slice it, it seems like he would have every right to take what is already his. And yet he refuses. He invokes God. He goes down afterward and says, see, I have a corner of your robe. I spared your life. Let the Lord judge between the two of us, because I won't. Let the Lord make this decision, because I will not force his hand. Let the Lord make this decision because he is my God and he is the Lord. So I will not harm you. That is an incredible display of someone who has been willing to wait on God, to wait on God's timing. Instead of reaching out and just taking what is within arm's reach, they say, no, if God wants me to have that now, he will give it to me now. I'll wait. So it begs the question, how in the world is David able to have this self-restraint? How in the world is David able to make these decisions that seem inhuman? And I think that a lot of it has to do with how David saw the world. He didn't see it in terms of men and things and positions. He saw it as a relationship only between him and his God. So there's an interesting book series that started out as a radio show. It's called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's called a trilogy of books, but there are 5 books, which should tell you what kind of a book series it is. It's incredibly strange. But one of the characters, his name is, I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation. I never listened to the radio show, but it's Zaphod Beeblebrox. The guy has 2 heads. It gets stranger from there. But at one point, he commits this crime. And they set about trying to fix it and trying to punish him for it, which is a simplification, but for the purposes, we'll run with it. And they've got this machine called the Total Perspective Vortex, which is, they talk it up in the book as being absolutely almost inhumane in how mean it is and how only the worst people really need to go in there. And so what they do is they throw Zaphod inside and shut the door. And what this machine does is it shows you a mental picture of the entire universe. And so you see everything. You see the entire expanse laid out before you. And then, you look at it for a second and you notice this tiny little sign somewhere. And it's this tiny little label that says, "You are here." And the whole purpose of this machine is to show you just how small you are in relation to the vastness of the universe. And the theory in the books was that it would be impossible to get a true perspective of where you are in the universe without having it change your perspective and change who you are. Of course, in the books, it drove everyone crazy. But I think that the illustration holds true for David. I think David saw the vastness of creation and the hugeness of his God, and he saw somewhere in God's plan this tiny little sign labeled, "David, you are here." And so whether or not Saul died today, whether or not David lived in a cave for another 3 or 4 years, whether or not Saul ever gave up chasing David, and whether or not he died as king of old age, and David didn't become king until he was an old man himself, none of that was really a concern to David. If you read the things that David said throughout that story, they were all based around his relationship to God and not men. What kind of person and what kind of relationship he had with God. Because his circumstances were temporary, and he knew that. Because he saw the vastness of God's plan for the world. And he realized that he was that tiny little sign off the sign that says, "You are here." And all he had to do was trust God, and the God who had created the universe would guide him along in his path on life and take care of him, because that God loved him. And so it's easy to get frustrated. In the last couple weeks, I imagine it was very easy to get frustrated, especially if you didn't have air conditioning. If you're kind of hot and sweaty and it's kind of disgusting, it's easy to get frustrated with people. What I'd like us to remember this morning is this story of David, and this story of how David chose not to reach out and take what seemed like it should be his, because he understood the perspective and the long term, and he understood just exactly how big his God was. It's a matter of trust and waiting on God's plan and waiting for God to decide things for us. And to receive the good gifts from our Father, not reach out and take what we think we deserve from him. I'm not done thinking about this story, and I hope you're not either. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't possibly do it justice, which is why I spent so much time just simply reading it to you. And so this week, I hope each and every one of you could maybe take the opportunity to read all the way through, 1 Samuel, just to see David's progression and David's level of trust. And that's something that I think we could all aspire to. So as the worship team comes forward, I'd like to offer up this time for prayer. The altar is open if you'd like to use it. But I'd just like to pray and just to ask God to show us our next step and to share with us what gifts he wants to give us and to help us to wait on him, because that's superhuman. It's more than we can do on our own. Pray with me. Dear Lord, I thank you this morning for being with us and for taking care of us. It's easy to forget that the air we breathe, the food we eat, the ground we walk on, they're all gifts from you. I thank you for everything you've already given us, and I thank you for your plan for our lives that is based on your love for us. I pray that you would help us to trust you and to wait on you. I pray that even when life is confusing, and even when it doesn't make sense, and even when it seems like you're holding something back, I pray that you would either give us understanding or give us the wisdom to know that we don't need to. I pray for this congregation and the VBS we've got coming up. I just pray that you would bring more kids than we are prepared for. I just pray that kids would pop up that we don't even know who they are. They're here. And I just pray that they would hear about you and they would learn to trust you and wait on you just as we aspire to. Bless our closing time of worship. I just pray that you would be with each of us today. Amen. Well, as you go about your week this week, I pray that each and every one of you will be able to wait on God and wait on a couple other things. Right after the service, we will be having that VBS meeting, so don't forget. And also for everyone, we have a new thing that I'm really excited about. We have coffee that is out there, and we have, I believe, some donuts and that kind of thing. So stick around, have some free coffee and donuts on us, and help out with VBS. Go in peace.